For some of you who don't know me, my name's Arianthe Stettner, and I have lived full-time in Routt County since 1971. Nonetheless, I'm not a native. There are some native family descendants here. I'm looking at the Withers, and Carl, I'm not sure if you're almost. And if I've missed anyone, raise your hand if you're a Routt County native. That will help me stay honest, and you feel free to correct me if I stray from reality or misinterpret something. But I think my interest in Routt County history started when I first came here, because the house that we lived in on County Road 14 was built in 1912. A wonderful log house that was a stop on the Stagecoach route between Walcott and Steamboat Springs. And you can see it now on the road to Stagecoach. We no longer own it, but it's on the right side of the road, and it says Ghost Creek Ranch. And so you will notice it as the only log house that I'm aware of in Routt County with Tuscan columns on the porch. It's quite wonderful. And for the time when it was built, 1912, it was indeed one of the finest houses in the area. But living in a historic house piqued my curiosity and interest in Routt County history. And so I began to pursue it in various ways, getting involved with creating the Routt County Historic Register and helping with my colleagues and friends to found Historic Routt County, and then getting involved with the city of Steamboat Springs when I was on city council with our historic preservation kind of infrastructure, and doing a lot of the preservation work that we get to enjoy today, making that possible. Things like the Mesa Schoolhouse that you'll get to visit later this summer, I hope, and of course the restoration of the yacht cabin and the city's ownership of the Steamboat Barn and the Hay Meadow Ranch, the Legacy Ranch out on the road to the golf course on Highway 40, and many other wonderful treasures. So I just completed a master's in historic preservation through Goucher College last year, and I wrote my thesis on Routt County barns. So I've gotten into it. and right now I am the president of Colorado Preservation, which is our statewide preservation advocacy group. And I get to see and help advocate for great preservation projects and advocacy all over the state, which is terrific. Let me just make a couple of notes. I keep thinking of things to tell you. What I'm going to start with and what I'll end with, because it will sort of be interesting on both sides of the equation, is the museum has a terrific bookstore. And many of the books that I have used for reference and have been inspired by are right here. These are everything from accounts of local homesteaders to a compilation of Routt County historic buildings. I had the privilege of getting to work on the reprint of this particular book, the Historic Guide to Routt County. So this is a must-have book if you like to explore Routt County and know a little bit about what you're seeing. But these are great stories about homesteaders and their adventures and mishaps, not only in Routt County, but since the Mantle Ranch is in Moffat County, about there too. And the more I read these accounts of homesteaders, they were a rugged lot. We are all such pansies these days. I mean, it is unbelievable the stories that people live to tell, and with such good humor, for goodness sakes. No complaints. Well, maybe they did complain among themselves, but the written record doesn't really show that. And a lot of colorful people here. So let me tell you about the Homestead Act. And what I'm going to do is I'll first give you sort of a the legal background of how the Homestead Act originated in U.S. history, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that were so interesting about the Homestead Act in terms of what the law of the land was like in 1862 and the opportunities it afforded, and then how you filed a homestead. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the homesteads that we can see either up close and personal or driving by slowly here in Routt County, and some of the people and stories I know. And I'm sure that some of you will have some stories as well. So we'll leave some time at the end for questions and answers. And I think that'll just zip us right through our time together. So I'm going to read parts of this so I don't get it wrong. Because what I found in researching the Homestead Act is that it was an iterative process. The law was created and it was created through a series of back and forth, and lawmakers of the day said, well, this is what it should be like. And then they found out that no, practically it really didn't work very well that way. We should do something a little different. So the setting, it's 1862. Abraham Lincoln is the President of the United States. The Louisiana Purchase is still pretty unsettled. The Civil War is wrapping up. There are people that are fed up with the kind of the feeling of war and chaos, and other people who are upset about the increasing industrialization of the cities without any sort of breathing room or sense of open spaces that was once part of the United States. And so the Congress was really concerned about how do we get people onto the land? How do we get people to settle this vast wilderness that needs to be settled so that manifest destiny could be realized for this taking over of the great continent? Now, people were moving around in the United States. They were going up the west coast of the United States to California to the gold rush in 1849. There was a lot of kind of hop, skip, and jump movement. So however they got there, whether overland or, on the oceans, they got to the west coast and settled California. But this big, vast, great American desert, Central Plains, Rocky Mountains were really uncharted territory. And much of it was Indian territory. And interestingly, here in Routt County, this closeness to our Indian background is indeed very real and very tangible, because this was a summer camping, hunting area for the Utes. And the Utes consisted of many tribes, but the Utes that were around here were the Yampatika Utes, and they loved the hot springs. They would come here to heal and to rest, and it was an area where many tribes converged, and it was sort of the Switzerland, maybe. Neutral territory where people could enjoy these healing springs. And perhaps Glenwood Springs was like that too. But at any rate, the Utes were here. The Crawfords write about their experiences with the Utes, playing with the Ute children. It was just part of how life was lived. However, I'll go back to 1862, because in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the first Homestead Act. And the first Homestead Act was based on the idea that one could have a successful farm with 160 acres. And 160 acres would be plenty to raise crops, all kinds of grains, to raise, to support your livestock and so forth. And what they didn't count on was west of the 100th meridian, it gets really dry. And all these legislators who were looking at the homestead law and helping to craft it. This is running from Bismarck, North Dakota, straight down south to, let's see, through kind of near Amarillo, Texas, and San Angelo, Texas, etc., etc. So all of Colorado is west of the 100th meridian, just for grins. And we know from living here, it's really dry here. But the people living on the East Coast could not fathom it, had never experienced it. So anyhow, yes?
How much would you guess the trains lobbied Congress to do the Homestead Act?
A number of things happened at the same time. So I'll speak to that a little bit. There was a lot of this and that going on. But the Homestead Act of 1862, and there was a name for the Railroad Expansion Act, or whatever it was called, was almost but not quite concurrent, but in that time period. So let's say 1860s, 1870s. So anyhow, getting back to the Homestead Act, gotta stay on task. The first thing that happened, the precursor of that Homestead Act happened in 1841. It was called the General Preemption Act. And this allowed settlers to squat on public land before it was surveyed or before it was even acquired from the native people. And this is important because we can see it right here in the land records of Routt County. When I start to go back and look at the history of a property, I will see preemption. And people did preemptions a lot, knowing that they wanted to be on that parcel. It hadn't been surveyed, but they were going to stick around until the government survey came through and they could claim it. Some people, like the Crawford family, were resourceful, and Mr. Crawford came in 1874 to this part of Colorado, saw this gorgeous place, and he filed a claim in, I think, 1874, brought his family over in 1875, and paid to have it surveyed. So he really was the founder and the first homesteader in the community. But he had a preemption. And then when the Homestead Act came into existence, he was able to file a proper homestead. And when the official survey came into play, it was officially surveyed. So here is what happened. With proof of improvements and fees of $1.25 an acre, an applicant could obtain rights to own 160 acres. So I did a little inflation calculator. In 1913, let's say, which was the year that the most homesteads were filed in the United States, it was $1.25 an acre to file, or to pay your fee. That would be $29 an acre in 2012. So, but for someone to have that kind of money in that time, it meant you didn't really start homesteading with nothing. You had to have a little piggy bank to start with. So the thinking behind this particular act was that it was more important for the young country to settle and develop its vast holdings of public lands than to obtain revenue from their sale. Although still $1.25 an acre in the late 1800s was a lot of money. The 1841 Preemption Act led to a lot of abuses, a lot of land speculation, and it was repealed in 1891. So you don't necessarily see, even in our own land books, preemptions dating after that. They all come in the 1880s. So the 1862 Homestead Act was almost astonishing to me, even from this perspective, and that is any American, man or woman, freed slave, could apply for homestead. Now, this was 60 years before women could vote. How about that? Any foreigner who came to the United States and intended to apply for citizenship could apply for homestead. The other requirements was that they had to be 21 or older. They could take 6 months to build a residence, and then they had to have 5 years of continuous residence and cultivation of the parcel. Then at the time they would file their patent to officially own the parcel from the government, they paid a fee of $15, which in 2012 would be $348, and the parcel would be theirs. So while the act motivated thousands of homesteaders to file claims, the 160-acre allotment proved to be too small to succeed in this climate. The policy was modified in 1877 with the Desert Lands Act, which allowed claims up to 640 acres at 25 cents an acre, or $5.80 of a filing fee, and granted a patent to the owner after they showed that they had irrigated a portion of the land. And then a very interesting act happened, and Taylor, the congressman from the Glenwood Springs area, Edward Taylor, I think that was his first name, he was very, very influential in kind of reshaping this landscape. And he helped to draft the legislation for the Grazing Homestead Act. You could get 640 acres of land for a fee of $35, or $7.38 today. But this time the government severed the mineral rights. So these pre-1916 homesteads all had the mineral rights with them. The post-1916 homesteads did not. And therein lies a tale that's playing out today. So anyhow, we'll talk more about that later. So how did this play out today? From 1862 until 1934, when most homesteading was closed in the mainland United States, over 1.6 million homesteads were granted, totaling over 270 million acres, or over 10% of the land in the United States. The years between 1911 and 1915 were the peak years for homestead claims. Over 11 million acres were patented, or an area twice the size of the state of Massachusetts. So think of what was going on. In Colorado, there were 107,618 homesteads granted, 22 million plus acres, or 33% of the acreage in the state. That's a lot. Now, Nebraska had the highest percentage of homesteaded lands at 45%. Our neighbor to the north, Wyoming, had 29% of its lands homesteaded. North Dakota, 39%. And here's an interesting little anomaly. Utah, only 7% of its lands were homesteaded. And that speaks to a number of different things. You know, the Mormons came there earlier and they settled in a different way. There are a lot of lands that were deemed unsuitable for homesteads and so forth. And Oklahoma and Montana both had 34% of their states settled by homesteaders. So,
And what was the percentage for Colorado?
Colorado was 33%. Yeah. And the one that was the most was Nebraska at 45%.
Were all the homesteads 640 acres west of the?
No, they were different, and certainly my research here in Routt County has found that you could, in the original Homestead Act, you could have up to 160 acres. But if you found the perfect parcel and it was 142 acres, And it had, you know, the protected land, a little bit of meadowland, a nice stream going through, etc. You grabbed it even if it was a few acres short. And in some cases, people would put together parcels. But we'll talk about all of that stuff too. So homesteading in the West was not easy. Nationally, the rate of failure on dry lands was high, with over half of the original homesteaders unable to complete their entries. For every successful ranch or farm that was homesteaded and patented, there were 4 original homestead entries and 2 final entries. So, and then of course, they may have changed hands. Several research studies documented that women comprise 12% of the homesteaders who filed in Wyoming, North Dakota, and Colorado at the start of the 20th century, and 42% of them successfully proved up. This was slightly higher than the homesteads proved up by men, which was 40%. And we'll talk about that. Remind me to talk about just what this meant for women, because it's an interesting story. Homesteading wasn't cheap. In the early 1900s, the cost to homestead include the filing fees, $15 to $25 in those times, the surveyor's fee to locate the claim and its boundaries, from $30 to $100, and $100 in 1913 would be $2,321 today. The purchase of water rights, maps, and notary fees. And in some cases, when the homesteaders were just not going to sit out and wait the 5 years, they bought the land after they had originally filed on it and shortened up their time. Candace?
Why do they have to buy water rights? They have water in the property.
Water rights did not run with the land. And that's a whole other story that I'm not the person to tell. But usually when you bought the land, water rights were separate, and people filed on water rights usually at the same time or maybe even before they filed on the land, to make sure that they had access to irrigation and the water they needed to do their agriculture. So additionally, a homesteader needed money for travel expenses, livestock, food, supplies, building materials, fencing materials, agricultural tools, and maybe hiring someone to help out now and then. So, interestingly, the growing concern about overgrazing and the parcelization of the remaining public lands caused the homesteading era to end, at least in the continental United States, this western United States, in 1934, with the passage of the Taylor Grazing Act. And it was Routt County's own Ferry Carpenter who went to Washington to help implement this particular legislation. And the federal government reclassified the remaining public lands and allowed grazing through a limited permitting process. So really a lot of interesting things happened in Routt County history. We had a lot of, it was almost like the tipping point of homesteading happened here. So what did you have to do to file a homestead? How did that work? So the first thing that would happen is an applicant would, of course, find a piece of land, and having identified that parcel, they would go to the nearest government land office and check to see if that parcel had already been taken or not, or sort of make some adjustments. And in the early years, that government land office was in Glenwood Springs. So using survey coordinates, the officials would check previous ownership claims to make sure the land was available. The applicant would pay a filing fee of $10 and a $2 commission to the land agent, and return to the land to begin the proving up process. Proving up entailed building a home, farming the land, not all of it. Imagine farming 160 acres, pulling up all that sagebrush and what have you, and living on the parcel for at least 5 to 7 months a year, and this kept changing over time for the next 5 years. Interestingly, one of the requirements was that the homesteader would have to build a 12 by 14 dwelling. However, the law did not say if it was feet or inches. So you can imagine some of the things that people did to sort of, get the letter of the law but not the intent. That was a very interesting sort of story. And then another thing that was interesting about the Homestead Law was that veterans who served in the Civil War and in the Spanish-American War and later in World War I were able to reduce their stay on the homestead by the same amount of time that they had served in the military. So it was a way to sort of reward our veterans at the time. And in fact, James Crawford was a Civil War veteran and was able to shorten his homestead duration by at least 1 and possibly 2 years. I can't quite remember. So anyhow, and it was a way that a lot of these unemployed Civil War veterans had a place to go and could create a new life for themselves and could, gain a foothold in the West and so forth. When the necessary requirements had been completed and the homesteader ready to take legal possession of the land, he or she would find at least 2 friends or neighbors willing to vouch for the truth of the improvements that had been completed and sign the proof document. And what I could not tell was, did they have to go to Glenwood Springs too? What I did find is in the local papers, there are many, many articles about the different aspects of homesteading, from the new laws being passed, to stories of people homesteading, to the legal documents that went with proving up. And it lists the name of the homesteader, who accompanied them and vouched for their improvements, and of course the legal description of the land that was homesteaded. So the interesting thing was the homesteader would then pay the final filing fee and receive a patent for the land signed with the name of the President of the United States. And many of these early homestead documents were treasured family mementos, and people would have them framed in their homes. There was another part of that. And this plays out in Routt County and probably other places too. As soon as the land was theirs, they were required to pay property tax. Because before that, it was government land. After that, it was not. And so I didn't realize this in my early research, but once I started going into the record on a number of these historic places, I'm going, filed on the land in 1906, received their patent in 1938. What's going on here? And then, my research said, well, then you get to pay taxes. And there are some very funny little comments in these old newspaper articles about the privilege of paying taxes, but at any rate. So I used to think it was because, and it's rightly so, many people just couldn't afford that final filing fee. Many people couldn't get to Glenwood Springs to do that paperwork. And especially in the Depression, that filing fee represented a lot of money, $15, although it doesn't sound like a lot today. One of the little anecdotes along that line is a homestead that some of you may have seen without kind of knowing the backstory. And if you've been to Stagecoach State Park, and how many of you have been there and you drive up to the entry and you see the little dilapidated cabins on the right side, and they're just sort of melting into the earth. There's a log cabin and couple of odd outbuildings, and those belonged to Clarence McKnight. And Clarence McKnight was, I guess you'd call him your typical eccentric homesteader, but because he, there were families that homesteaded, and then there were just these free spirit types. So Clarence was a coal miner, and he never had a vehicle. He worked in one of the mines outside of Oak Creek, but he filed on his homestead in 1917, and he did just enough work, grew a few acres of wheat, had a few chickens, did just the minimum to do to prove up on his homestead. But when he died in 1957, he still hadn't filed for his patent. And he lived alone and was just kind of, he and his dog actually. And there are some interesting stories about him. But at any rate, when he died, one of his relatives completed the patent and then sold that parcel to a neighbor. And it was used for grazing purposes. And then, of course, now it's part of the Stagecoach State Park property. I think that looking at what the Homestead Act afforded, it was a uniquely American piece of legislation. The way a person with meager resources but a lot of ambition or energy or determination could earn a piece of land from the government. Interestingly, it was hard work, and by the 30s, when we had the great droughts and the economy was down and there was no agricultural market, etc., a lot of these Western agricultural homesteads were abandoned. They were leased to other ag operators, or even sold back to the government. Evidence of difficulties of dryland farming, and even the inability to raise enough livestock to support a family on allotments of 640 acres. An interesting little spin on that is that the homesteaders who did in fact have mineral rights were able, in many cases, to keep their land because they would either lease or sell those mineral rights to, speculators or oil or coal developers. And so that provided them with an income during the hard times. And of course, the post-1916 homesteads, they never had the mineral rights, and those were severed, and the government able to sell them or rent them or lease them, I should say, to people who were interested. Couple of things about this that I want to be sure to say is that homestead dwellings were typically modest, and they were 12 by 14, and the ones that we see here are feet, not inches. And most people used the resources that were on their parcel of land, which were logs. And some people had better skill sets for stacking logs than others. And oftentimes, especially women homesteaders, they would hire someone to do this work. In Routt County, as the railroad was getting built, there were a lot of Scandinavian timbermen who came in. And so some of these Scandinavian, there's a name for these timber workers that eludes me right now. But
Lumberjacks?
well, lumberjack, it's a different name that I'd not heard before. But at any rate, they would put together in their tradition from Europe cabins that met these requirements. And so it's interesting to kind of go around the county or anywhere where you see log cabins and speculate as to what are the roots of who built this cabin. It may be the person who owned the land or the person who was hired by the homesteader to build it, and what building tradition do they know. And so there are all kinds of interesting cabins here. And so as you look at the landscape, you will see that people who didn't know how to build a log cabin and needed to build something in a hurry built something called a hog trough cabin. And if you've been out to the Mad Creek barn, that will show you that is a good example of a hog trough building. And it's essentially logs are stacked up on each other or laid down on the ground next to each other. And then a plank is put at the very end of each log, of the log. So picture, here are the logs, here's the plank across the top. It is, you make a wall. You put the plank on the other end of the log, then you raise it up, and then you build all 4 walls, and then you nail the planks together at the end. No joining, no craftsmanship, but fast. So and then you will see cabins put together other ways with dovetail joints. Those are really European born. V notches, and with a little more time, saddle notches. And so pay attention to these little subtle differences, and you'll get a sense of the fact that these log cabins aren't quite as homogeneous as they would seem on first glance. So interestingly, and I don't know that it happened a lot with original homesteads here in Routt County, but in other parts of Colorado, homesteaders would sometimes acquire surplus boxcars, railroad boxcars, and use them for their homesteads. And Paul Bonifield knows about all the boxcar dwellings in South Routt County, and it's really fun to explore with him about where these, some of these boxcar dwellings, or if they weren't lived in, they were used for barns and storage and things like that. So the other thing that's interesting is people, especially in the 1880s and early 1900s, before the railroad came. Yes? Question?
No, my brain was thinking.
Oh. Anyhow, people used the materials that they had on hand, and so there wasn't tar paper. If it was here, it had to be brought in by wagon or horse or something. And so many of these early homesteads had sod roofs, and then with sheets or newspaper sort of underneath so that the sod and the moisture wouldn't leak into the house. They had dirt floors, and it was rough. It was just beyond rough. So here are a couple of things. A timeline for Routt County was that, Crawford was one of the earliest homesteaders filing his preemption claim in about 1875. And then getting back to the native people, Nathan Meeker was sent out to Meeker, Colorado to help settle the Utes, and who were the native people of this area. Well, the Utes had no need to be settled. They were living a great life, and they loved to race their horses, and things were fine with them. They were friendly with the white settlers. There weren't too many of them, etc. But Nathan thought that it was a good thing for them to learn to become farmers and settled, and that was, the paradigm of the day. And with the best of intentions, he plowed up their racetrack, and their favorite racetrack for horses. And this was, the straw that broke the camel's back. It was the final incident that then, through a series of misunderstandings and fiascos on both sides, led to the Meeker incident. And the culture of the day in Colorado and in the West was that the Utes must go. Get them out of here. We're going to grab this land for white settlers. And the Utes were forced to leave. So by 1881, they were gone from Colorado. And while there are tales of the Utes coming back and almost furtively to their ancestral lands and meeting up with the Crawfords and the other settlers that they had gotten to know, they weren't really allowed here. And if they had been discovered, it would not have been a pretty picture. And so, of course, hot on the heels of the Utes' expulsion, there were great surveys done of this western landscape that was now open to settlement, and of the great Yampa coal fields. And all of that put together kind of opened a land rush here in Routt County. And it wasn't easy getting here in the late 1880s, 1890s, up until 1908, because you either had to walk, ride a horse, or ride a stagecoach. So that was not easy or comfortable. and while a lot of people did come here, it wasn't until the railroad came, the Moffett Railroad from Denver to Steamboat Springs arrived in the December of 1908. And granted, it came, I think the railroad was in Yampa, probably late 1907. And it didn't reach Craig until 1913. But then you could have homesteaders kind of come out in phases. And what they would do is the first family member would come out, figure out a piece of land, lay a claim on it, put a claim on it, go back home, and persuade the rest of the family, come join me in this paradise. And then they would put their stuff on a railroad car instead of the covered wagon. And the railroad car full of their goods would come, drop them off in Yampa, Oak Creek, Steamboat Springs, Hayden, or wherever, and then they'd have a wagon to haul their goods to their homestead. So it was way more convenient than it had been decades earlier, but it still wasn't very easy. And so later homesteads, if you look at the cultural landscape and you look at what you're seeing on maybe a ranch homestead or something, you can kind of read the evolution of the place. Because earliest homesteads, the buildings are pretty small, pretty simple, and made of log. And in many cases, a homesteading family would build a barn first and maybe live up in the hayloft, have their animals downstairs, maybe have part of the loft reserved for their feed and their tools and what have you. And then as soon as they could, they would build a little cabin to live in. And then when sawmills came, and if they were established enough, then they would have milled lumber and build a more modest home. And if you look at almost the history of the Crawford house, that's a good example. Crawfords first built a modern cabin, and maybe a decade later, or a log cabin, I said that backwards. They first built a log cabin, the sawmills came, they built a modest frame house, which is just up the hill from the site of their cabin. And then once they were established and he had, a foothold in the community, they built a stone house using local materials. But that all happened over probably a 30-year period. And as they became more able to make a living in the Wild West. So what I wanted to do was, how are we doing time-wise?
We have about 15 minutes.
Okay, well this is good. I can kind of give you some examples of which I'm aware, and then we'll have some Q&A. And so thinking about homesteads that you might see and you can look for as you drive through the countryside here in Routt County. I'll start from the south of Routt County and kind of work my way up. In Egeria Park, or the Yampa area, one of the earliest homesteads was how you say, placed or filed by the Bird family. And I can't remember Grandpa Bird's first name, but he filed in William, thank you. And he came out with his family. He had been mining, he and his family had been mining in Leadville, got disenchanted with that sort of smoky industrial boom town, and came up north, lured by the tales of this beautiful, fertile Egeria Valley, South Routt County. And his homestead is really a gem to look at. It's in ruins today, but if you drive, there's a road that is between Yampa and Phippsburg. It's the back road, and I think the cemetery is along that road as well. And if you're leaving Yampa heading north, it's on the left side. There is this little sort of what looks like a pile of logs until you stop and study it. And there you see a log cabin with a bay window. The bottom logs have rotted into the ground, and you can see the remnants of the sod roof. And behind it are, it's the skeleton of their barn. And it would be wonderful to at least stabilize that structure. I know of no other log buildings in Routt County with bay windows. And the Bird family, of course, were just influential in helping to bring community to South Routt County. Another area, of course, is the Stagecoach area. And I did some research on the historic homesteads of Stagecoach for the Stagecoach State Parks. And they are now starting to offer some history lectures and tours there. And it was really quite interesting that it's a pattern that once we identified it, we found in many places. Oftentimes, a homestead, family members would come out in groups, and they would do their very best to file on adjacent parcels. So if Dad was here, a sister was here, a brother was there, but no wives of homesteaders could file, only single women. And if that woman became married, that homestead would pass to the husband. So that was kind of like an awkward moment in today's thinking. But at any rate, they would have to be combined. But you couldn't be married. You could be widowed or you could be single, but you couldn't be married and file for a homestead. So a lot of these homesteads were combined, and that way the families would get enough land to really have the acreage they needed to run an agricultural operation, whether for grazing or raising grain or raising hay or whatever. And so in Stagecoach, it was a very savvy group of people who were all family members. Their names right now I forget, but there were generations. So the first people came in the late 1880s. They came in, they immediately filed for water rights, they filed their homestead claims, they started proving up the land, they got everything all built up, and then they sold out to the next generation. So there were real estate developers that are really long ago in Steamboat's history. and so the same thing you'll find that without such a mind to development and selling out, going up Yellow Jacket Pass or even going up into Pleasant Valley, there are examples of family members who filed on adjacent or very close by homesteads who worked together so that they could make a living on the land. And what's really interesting is that Pleasant Valley, interestingly, attracted a whole group of people from Switzerland and Germany. And so, you know, the today's homestead that the Gay family owns, and it's not a homestead, but the Gay Ranch consists of several homesteads, the Gabiud and the Lugans and the Zuffries, who were all from this town of Martinez, Switzerland, who all came out, whether because they knew each other, or like where the 20 Mile is, they're a group of Austrians, and their name was Feudal. And the whole Feudal family came out to 20 Mile Park and did a series of homesteads there. But these Swiss homesteads, the Gay family eventually were able to assemble and put together into the lovely ranch that they have today. And the same thing with the Raider Ranch. There was Henry and Harry and Henrietta and all of the names elude me, but they came out as family, you know, brother and a couple of brothers, and then they homesteaded adjacent to each other, and then when the father and the uncle passed away, the lands passed to the next generation, and you will see the Raider Ranch, those homestead buildings are gone, but the next generation of buildings is there. And then getting closer to town, I'm just making sure I don't overlook anything. The city has the Legacy Ranch where Yampatika holds its summer camps. The original homestead building is not there, but what's interesting about that property is it was homesteaded by a woman, Elizabeth Hutchinson, and she actually filed on several parcels of land as well as coal and mineral rights. And then by 1900 she sold and moved. I believe she moved away, but that's when the Arnolds bought the ranch, and then it sort of evolved through various ownerships. It's now owned by the city of Steamboat Springs and has been restored, and it's used by Yampatika for an interpretive center. And then of course the Yacht cabin at the Steamboat Barn. The Yachts were the homesteaders and the homesteading family. Their cabin kind of melted into the ground after they sold their land. And they sold their land to the Moors in 1957. So they totally missed the big boom in real estate. They were a real agricultural family. But it was one of the Yachts who built the barn, the Steamboat Barn. The Moors bought it in 57, and even though it's called the Moor Barn or the Steamboat Barn, they really just used it, and it's all about timing and location. And historic Routt County at least has restored the Yacht homestead, which was, until several years ago, a pile of logs that didn't read like anybody could ever have lived there. And it was reassembled working with a crew from the Rocky Mountain Youth Corps, and the project is, you know, what a homestead cabin looks like. And when you look at that, you'll see that they built the original cabin, and then when they needed to expand, they built a little addition to it in a T shape. And in here are some great accounts of some of the homestead cabins and trials and tribulations that happened up Elk River, even further west at the Mantle Ranch, and what that was like to homestead. And those are some of the later homesteads in that Yampa Canyon. Mary Brown, who was the sheep herder of Elk River Valley, writes of her life as a homesteader. And how many of you have been to the Carpenter Ranch? So picture that house, the White House where we all go, the interpretive center. When Ferry Carpenter was finally able to purchase that property, there were a number of homesteads that had been assembled to make the ranch. And he took all old homestead cabins, actually I think it was the previous owners, dragged them from here and there and everywhere, and made the house that we see today. So now you have to look at the house again, and you sort of wonder why the rooms don't quite flow. So, anyhow, another interesting footnote to the homesteading story, and I think it's more unique to women than to men, at least in the stories I've read, is that a lot of times women from cities they worked as secretaries or as school teachers or whatever. They saved up a little bit of money. And, 112 years ago, there weren't a whole lot of opportunities open to women that were respectable. And you could, but one way a resourceful woman could get ahead of it was to be a homesteader. It was respectable. I mean, it was daring and it was, hard work, but a woman could, with resourcefulness and determination, have a chance to build some equity in something. And so a lot of these women from the Midwest or from other urban areas would save their money, file on a homestead, live on it for 5 months a year, and do what they needed to do, go back to wherever they had their professional jobs during the winter, earn some more money, come back in the summer, work on their homestead, fulfill the requirements, and then be able to file legitimately on their homestead. And some of these women stayed on their homestead. Other women said, okay, I've got a piece of land here and I'm selling it. And they could sell it and make some money and then go on to, close that chapter and move on to the next one. One of the things that's interesting is for those of you who like to get lost doing research, there's a great website called Colorado's Historic Newspapers. And you can, newspapers from as early as, I think the 1860s all the way up to 1923, all over Colorado have been digitized and are available on the web. There's nothing available after 1923 because of copyright laws. But I was just getting ready for our visit today, and I thought I'd see the word homestead in the papers in Routt County. So, in the Yampa Leader, from 1903 to 1914, there were 614 articles with the word homestead in them. In Oak Creek, in their newspaper, there were 603 articles from 1909 to 1922. In the Routt County Republican, which was based in Hayden, there must have been a land office there because there were lots of public notices, but there were over 1,400 articles about homesteads. These were articles, legal notices, what have you. The Routt County Sentinel, which was competition to the Pilot, from 1905 to 1922, had 1,200 articles, and the Steamboat Pilot from as early as 1903 to 1923 had 1,900 articles about homesteads and homesteaders. And sometimes these would be legal documents showing that someone filed, or in later years, you started getting things like for sale, homestead relinquishments, or for sale, first class homestead. That was a woman homesteader who completed her claim, or many things like that. And then in 1920, here's an interesting statistic. Routt County entrymen secured title to 24,000 acres of land in probably 1919. This land was acquired by 133 individuals under the Homestead and Desert Land Acts. And let's see, the assessor got the information from the land office in Glenwood Spring, Now these information will be used by the assessor to make up tax schedules for the year. It is an amount of land as great as was acquired in the 4 years previously. So anyhow, that is what I can share with you about homesteading today. And thank you. And do you have any questions or comments, or Sandra?
Okay, so there was not a length of time. When you talked about the first Homestead Act, I thought you said you had to kind of complete the process in 5 years.
5 years.
Right, but then later,
Then it shortened to 3 years.
yes,
Because they could see that it wasn't working. For 5 years and 160 acres, people were just failing.
yeah.
It was a long time to prove up on land that was marginal for agriculture. Imagine, there was an attempt, interestingly, to set up a utopian homestead colony north of Craig called the Great Divide. And there are some ruins left from that, but a group, I think it was advertised in Europe, or Europeans who were just coming here were sort of lured to free land in the Wild West, come to the Great Divide. And I think it's Government Ammons. I know enough to be dangerous, so don't quote me. But at any rate, I mean, picture these barren, sagebrush covered lands, badlands. Well, they certainly didn't make it. And, there were some people who, because they had some proximity to water and irrigation, could do something, but most people couldn't. That's why there were so many failures.
Right, but then later it sounded like you could take a long time, as you said, to file for the patent.
Right.
You said,
So it went from no sooner than 5 years with the original Homestead Act could you file your patent. And then no sooner than 3 years for the Desert Lands Act could you file. But it didn't say how many years you could wait before you filed for your patent. Yeah, but you couldn't rush it, except for veterans who every year's service was kind of equal to a year of being on the homestead. But they still had to meet the requirements. So even if, let's say, they've been in the military for 3 years and they had a 3-year homestead requirement, if they hadn't proved up and if they hadn't built their house and irrigated the requisite number of acres and had the requisite number of crops and the fencing, they had to do that part of the equation too. So a couple of things. Georgianne?
Well, did someone from the government follow up on all this? Was it just an act of faith that people were honest about these things? And
Well, no. As usual. As Paul Bonifield writes very well about this. And there were a lot of things that I don't know that much about, but they're called dummy entries. And so somebody would come in, they'd file on a piece of land strategic to a mining company, or strategic to a potential right-of-way, or something. And then he would hire a couple of people to say, okay, you say I put a house here, and I did my fencing, and I built my barn, and we'll file on it, and I'll rate the right number of years and get my patent. But those were called dummy entries, and there was a lot of fraud around there. And the government didn't have the resources to monitor the integrity and honesty of every homestead claim. And so, as usual, as so often happens, the laws made with the best of intentions yielded unintended consequences. So, John?
One of the motivations for the Homestead Act, as you have said, was to get the country settled, to move people, further west. But but I'm interested in the underlying assumption about the emphasis on property. I've read something recently that North America really followed a British system, which emphasized property and property rights, whereas South America emphasized a Spanish system, which actually was more interested in having slaves and people, not so much property. So would you agree that that there's a British influence in this whole business of well, in the Midwest, for example, when they moved across the Appalachians,